that residential is also kind of like a protective bubble, you might say, where if life has a lot of challenges, or like, even just messages in the world that are particularly overwhelming, in trying to approach recovery, residential treatment provides kind of this safety net of, all of the staff are, informed about recovery oriented work, and they can hold space for someone, and to some extent kind of give them some space slash, protect them a little bit from the outside world and the messages of the outside world. I think that there's, there are ways that is really important in the beginning stages for some folks, and then there's an integration that I think is really important for them to be prepared to step down back into the world as well.
Welcome to the RD Roadmap, Journey to Eating Disorder Expertise. This is episode 13, The 14ers, Understanding Residential Level of Care, with interview guest Amanda Mellowspring. Welcome, Amanda. So excited to having you. My name is Jill Sakey, registered dietitian and certified eating disorder specialist. And
My
Mateus,
name is Mateus. I'm a registered dietitian as well.
And we are so grateful to have Amanda Mellowspring with us today, who's also an eating disorder specialist, certified eating disorder specialist. And we're continuing on our journey to understanding levels of care. And so we wanted to have Amanda on to talk about residential, and just kind of go in depth about that more so for those that haven't really experienced, maybe haven't worked in that level of care, and also who really don't have a maybe large enough sense of what this level of care is like. And so I thought it would be great to have guest speakers coming in, kind of talking about their experiences. And you've had a ton of experience. So I know you have just a vast experience level and all of that. I would love to just for you to talk about what you're doing now, because I know you're not necessarily in residential, you're in a different position now, but would love to have you talk about like what you're doing now, and then maybe dig into what your experience was at residential level of care. But I'll let you start with introduction, and then I'll ask the question when you're finished.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Jill and Mateus. I'm so excited to be part of this. I love that you're doing this, and I feel really honored to be a guest. So thank you for having me. So I am currently, I have recently joined Healthier Tomorrows, which is a large outpatient nutrition practice based out of Chicago, but serves clients around the country, as their chief operating officer. So I am really excited to be part of the expansion, and kind of catching up on the growth that they've experienced. It's an established practice that started about 15 years ago and just continues to grow. So we work with clients of all nutrition and wellness related needs, through a non-diet and trauma-informed lens.
Yeah. Oh, cool. So, and that was that just recently, I think, right? That you
Yes, just a recent change. So I'm really excited as I'm integrating there.
Well, they're going to be blessed to have you kind
Thank
of as
you.
their, kind of leaders there and supporting. So, well, I
Thank
got
you.
to know you through IADEP a little bit, and also just through consultation with my own private practice when I had a large group practice, with supervision and things like that. I really leaned on your knowledge of your experience in residential care, but also kind of training new dietitians. I feel like that's something that was having heard you speak at several conferences and things like that. That was a big role that you had when you were vice president of nutrition services at Monte Nido. And I know they've kind of gone through an evolution of change, so we won't go into that. But I really was curious, what would you say for someone who's newer in the field, or for them to grasp, like what is residential versus maybe PHP and IOP level of care? How would you best describe that? In your
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, because I think that there's a difference on the provider kind of perspective, and then there's certainly a difference from the client perspective as well. The way that I conceptualize it a lot is I think residential treatment is a great opportunity for an individual to kind of step away from most things in their life, put most things on pause, or hand them over for someone else to hold on to, so that they can commit 100% of their energy as possible to their recovery work in a residential environment. So certainly you have a higher level of care as far as more kind of medical nursing oversight as well, but there's also 24/7 therapeutic and nutritional support. I would say from the provider lens as well, you have the kind of luxury at that level of care of one, getting to know someone on a deeper level because you spend a lot of non-therapeutic time, you might say, with them as well, just kind of in between things and kind of going between different events or just downtime. And so you get to know all of the individuals that you're working with on a little bit of a more personal level. But also you have the luxury of almost knowing everything that's happening in their life. So you know what they're eating, how much they're eating, you know what may be happening as far as behaviors or challenges for them. So for the most part, you have a picture that you don't get at any other level of care regarding what someone is doing nutritionally and movement wise, et cetera, throughout the day, what's happening for them emotionally, et cetera. So I think that those are some unique things about residential level of care. It's a much more intensive environment as far as kind of what's happening and what is, what the expectations are often for the clients and families as well. That's going to happen in a relatively short period of time. I would say PHP level of care is an interesting like in between because you can either be stepping up to PHP or stepping down to PHP. So you have clients coming from both directions and really working on still typically primarily treatment focused for the majority of their day and majority of days a week. But they're starting to integrate back into their life or they're still holding on to some things in their life and they're trying to really capture recovery in that. And I think, again, you still have, as a provider, you still have a picture of what's happening for most of the day, but you're really leaning on the client to share what's happening for them outside of treatment and as far as work, school, movement, family, et cetera. And then I often say that, IOP level of care, in my opinion, is the hardest in a lot of ways. Not that they're not challenges at every level of care, but I would say IOP level of care to me is particularly challenging from the client and provider perspective because there's a full integration of life and recovery happening at the same time. As a provider, you have less information about what they're doing throughout the course of the day, and you really have to rely on that rapport for a client to share with you what's happening. You have to know what questions to ask for them to share with you. It's very similar to outpatient work, as you know. And then from a client perspective, it's a lot. It's either most of the time I find that clients go 100% back into their life and their regimen for the most part. And they're also doing recovery 100%. And so they've got 200% of 100% to give that's happening. And so I often think that level of care is particularly challenging. I think if it's the right time for someone, it can be a beautiful transition. But I think it's particularly challenging when someone's attempting to use that level of care to avoid a higher level of care where they would really potentially benefit. So I think there are definitely pros and cons to approaching each level of care from both perspectives.
Yeah. I love how you describe that, where I think residential kind of is a containment factor, where if they don't really have 200% to give, they need to take out 100%
Yes.
for a little bit so they can really devote their time to full recovery. And I've definitely seen that where they start in IOP trying to avoid residential when, I've never worked in necessarily residential, but PHP and IOP, and you can quickly tell that they need to bump back. We call it bump up to residential really quick. So
yes, yeah, and you mentioned something just then that I would just that I could say as well is that residential is also kind of like a protective bubble, you might say, where if life has a lot of challenges or like even just messages in the world that are particularly overwhelming in trying to approach recovery, residential treatment provides kind of this safety net of all of the staff are informed about recovery oriented work and they can hold space for someone and to some extent kind of give them some space / protect them a little bit from the outside world and the messages of the outside world. I think that there's there are ways that is really important in the beginning stages for some folks, and then there's an integration that I think is really important for them to be prepared to step down back into the world as well,
be able to handle the outside
yeah,
too eventually.
exactly.
Well, how did you evolve into that position of vice president? That's a huge position and probably a lot more global. And I know maybe some listeners here are like, well, I'm just going to step into dietitian or therapist working in that. And I can imagine you've worked in that space too. So I was just wondering kind of how you evolved into that higher position, but also how you got into like residential and I guess even another layer of that question is like, what do you feel like you wish you had known to prepare for? Because I think a lot of people get their first experience sometimes in residential level of care as a dietitian or therapist. Sometimes outpatient, just trying to do outpatient work too. But I was just curious, like, I don't know, that's a twofold question, but I'll let you kind of go where you want to go on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, don't let me forget either part because
Okay.
I want to be able to speak to both. I'll start with maybe what I wish I knew going in, and I think I went into residential treatment as a dietitian pretty quickly in my career, and I think because of that, and you can't have it kind of all ways, and so you choose which way you're gonna do it. But I would say I don't think I had a full appreciation of what how much information outpatient providers hold as an inpatient or as a residential dietitian in the beginning. So I kind of went in and I was aware this is a really intensive level of care, and I spend all of this time with these clients, and I know them so well within a very short period of time. I don't think I fully appreciated the fact that outpatient providers have a ton of information that they might have been working with an individual for weeks, months, years, even before they come into residential level of care. And the things that they know about what has worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, what they need to be able to accomplish in residential level of care for it to be successful and for that transition back into their life to be meaningful. I don't think I fully appreciated that for some time in the course of my work. And so I feel like that's something I wish that I knew, is just how important that collaboration is, and how it expedites the work in residential treatment. So that's something I think I wish that I knew. There are a million things that I wish I knew more about just humanity, probably going in to work with all of these people and how unique and individual every single person is. And I mean, how quickly you hone counseling skills that you might never have known you had when you're spending that much therapeutic time with people. But the path to the role that I had was really a kind of a long-term dedication that grew out of necessity, I would say. So my experience in residential care kind of spanned 3 or 4 different organizations before I landed there, and worked primarily in residential level of care, also PHP and IOP levels of care. And then when I landed with that organization, I started when they were 1 8-bed residential facility, and I was the dietitian on site, working with those clients. And I remember the first day I was there, I was told, guess what? We got the building next door and we're growing. And so I kind of anticipated that, but I kind of laugh that was my whole experience working there, is that was just growth from day one. And so a lot of my kind of growth into leadership was born out of necessity. It's like, okay, we're going to grow. We need to have more staff. And so in this department, we need to have more chefs, more dietitians. We need, our recovery coaches to be, trained in nutrition. And so my role just kind of grew as the organization grew in many ways. And there were times where I was kind of worked in different capacities with the organization as it grew. And I had my own kind of life changes and relocations and kind of came in and out in different ways. And as there was growth, there was a need to kind of conceptualize care. There were different models of care at different times because of some mergers and acquisitions and different programming for different age groups. And so there were opportunities to really focus and hone in on kind of one piece at a time. And that was a neat opportunity of growth as well. I would also say there was necessity, but there was also a lot of advocacy. So I really took my role seriously, and I do in every way that I continue to work in this field, that it's my responsibility to advocate for the field of nutrition, for what dietitians actually do, even for what tech providers are doing. So they're called recovery coaches. So like my job absolutely 100% was to advocate for everyone that interacted around the nutrition piece, which in residential treatment is pretty much everybody. But part of that was advocating for myself. And so in order for our department to be seen and to have a seat at the table, I really felt like it was my responsibility to make sure that I could put a seat at the table. And so I really learned more about myself in how to advocate for our department, how to advocate for myself, and how to show my strengths, and how to look for ways to continue to grow as a leader. So it was out of necessity, but it was also really intentional through a lot of advocacy, to say, in residential level of care, food and nutrition are such a pivotal part of the experience, and a necessity for there to be a lot of containment and oversight and compassion. And so I would say, it flowed very much alongside the growth of the organization, but it really took a lot of kind of grit behind the scenes to make sure that we were included as a profession in those conversations and discussions about what growth would look like.
Yeah, I keep thinking of like a table that fits like 8 chairs and you're shoving a 9th one in.
Yes, absolutely. You really learn a lot about yourself when you have to learn to be that person where you're like, I'll just get my own chair and I'll bring it and I'll sit here anyways.
Yeah.
And if that's not your personality, it's an interesting process to learn how to do that. And I think what really worked for me was that it wasn't really just about me. It was about me getting a seat at the table, but it was to advocate for everything that we were doing, and every dietitian and chef and recovery coach that worked in our facility anywhere in the country. So that, I think, was my motivation to be bold enough to be like, I'll just bring my own chair. I'll just fold it up and I'll bring it and I'll sit right here. So yeah,
I know it belongs on the deck, but it's not as pretty in this living room or dining room, but I'm putting it here.
That's right. Exactly. I'll bring it from the kids' table. Don't worry.
I remember just when I started my private practice and just what I didn't know and what I had to learn. And so a lot of the reason I tried to develop my private practice and train others was my own feelings of not knowing, and I didn't want people to go through that. So you kind of mentioned starting kind of in this level of care, you got to start somewhere. I get it. But I think sometimes what I think happens in various levels of care is there's not a lot of good training, things like that. So I'm just wondering, like, what, as you look back, and what have you advocated for, and how's that shifted for those that maybe start in that level of care? Because I know when I when I started looking for a job in the eating disorder field, I actually applied. And back then they were like, no, you have to have 3 to 5 years experience. And now they're taking people right out of school, going right into that level. And I know there's a ton more like programs and things like that and jobs out there. So that's a good thing. Dietitians have a more of an ability to have a presence in this field. And obviously we're needed in all of that too. But yeah, I was just curious, like how did you evolve some of that and advocate for dietitians coming in with helping them understand and know, and what would you have done differently, I guess, for yourself? So
yeah, and I think some of these are also things that I think, Jill, you and I have talked about over the course of time, and Mateus, you and I as well, because they're not innate to the field of nutrition. Because I would say the first thing is, and this is one of the things that I think is a little bit confusing for other providers in the eating disorder space in particular is that dietitians are not well trained in eating disorders, and so training is an important part of the onboarding experience for a dietitian to be successful at the residential level of care. They have to receive more training, not just on the day-to-day work as a dietitian in that space, but also eating disorders in general. So all of the nuances, medical nuances, therapeutic engagement with a client, there's so many things that I think we're doing better in nutrition education, but there's so much. It's such a specific area that was a big piece to advocate for, is making sure we had significant training for the dietitian and that they actually have time for that. Like, just because someone has an RD behind their name and they step into this work does not mean that they're ready to start, carrying a full caseload and managing all the ins and outs without support and training. And then beyond training, I think, is supervision. And, that's something that I know that we have all really advocated for in the field in general, but the idea of having ongoing case consultation and ongoing support around your experience with clients, supervision around the clinical work itself, but also professional engagement around, what the experience of providing that care is like, what's coming up for you as a provider. Dietitians are not trained and in the same way that therapists are to self-reflect on their interaction with clients. And so I think that those two pieces, training and ongoing supervision, are so significant in the success of a dietitian in this level of care and as an organization. When organizations kind of pull back on those pieces, I think that dietitians get overwhelmed really quickly, and I think the care really suffers as well. And those are things that I think I really advocate for in the field of nutrition and dietetics across the board in general, is more support and supervision, not just in the eating disorder space, but in general. I think there's so much to be learned from mentorship and collaboration and case consultation. So those I would say are probably the primary things that I really advocated for, other than making sure that there were more seats. It's like, pull a seat up at the table. Okay, I want to like bring some people up with me through the ranks, so to speak, so that there are, that there's not just a seat at the table, but there's like a whole team of layers supporting dietitians in ways that are really meaningful.
Yeah, oh, love that. I just think of that position of VP, where, rarely, I know dietitians really just kind of always had the back seat, kind of the third row instead of at the center table, where, it's always a psychologist or psychiatrist or those individuals kind of running the program, and they were all over everyone, where I thought that was a really unique position that you held in that training aspect of it. So I guess takeaway for me would be, as a new dietitian, if you're wanting to start with residential, trying to find a program that actually, says that they have some really good training and mentorship, that you're not just thrown to the wolves when you walk in there, assuming that which, and you'll just learn by, I always forget the phrase, learn by fire or whatever that phrase is. What is the phrase?
Right. Trial by fire.
Trial by fire. I'm like, why am I forgetting that term? But that trial by fire, which is just like, I just remember, being burned constantly and feeling like such a failure, or not knowing what I'm doing, those things. And, I feel like I advocated for myself and advocated for others coming into the field, whereas some people just kind of take it and, just burn out or leave or don't really learn well. And then they think they do. And then they maybe leave to outpatient so they can have their own charge of what they want to do. And who knows what's happening on that level of care when you don't really have really good training and understanding. So,
And I think that a part of like mentorship that is also so helpful is you mentioned the aspect of self-reflection, reflecting about how sessions went and everything. And I feel like if I didn't, I mean, I've got consultation with both of you, and I feel like if I didn't have that space, the conclusion that I would draw each time was like, well, I messed up. I'm a suck. That didn't go well, and to have that space, to talk about it and see that people have gone through the same struggles, and there there are positives, in everything that you're doing. I thought that was really good for my mental health, going through change, shifting perspective, shifting the focus of, my career, and feeling really supported, because there hasn't been a time that I went in a panic into supervision and people are like, "Oh my gosh, you struggling with that?" Never happened.
It's like, hey, I've been there, done that 500 times.
Whereas when you don't have that space and you are in an organization and nobody's really talking about it, it's really real easy to get in your head and like, well, it seems like everybody's thriving but me,
Love it.
Yeah, it's so humbling, the work that we all do. It's you have to always go in ready for anything. And I mean you're engaging and in relationships with other humans who are also, kind of going through various things and could bring in anything at any time. And so yeah, that the idea of always being open to what's coming and to kind of recognize that you might feel like you've really got things ready, and then they show up with something totally different. I think about that a lot actually in my experience in residential treatment. There was a time where I would run nutrition groups in like 3 different houses, and I would just go from one to the other, and then the next morning I would go to the third house, and I would run the same group because it was different groups, different milieus, and I would run the same group each time. And if it went well in the first place, I would think, oh, I've got this. This is going to be a great group. And then anything could happen in the second and third group. And then if something didn't go well in the first group, oh, maybe I should do a different group at the next house. But then I would go do it, and it would be a totally different experience because it's about how we work with humans, and people bring different things. Sometimes it's not even what we bring that makes as much of a difference in the conversation. So I totally resonate with what you're saying, Mateus.
I always think of basketball. Y'all have probably heard, or at least others don't. I've been a basketball mom, and like seeing my kiddos' playbook of basketball, like moves that you're doing on the court. That's great. You can know it, but you got to learn how to pivot really quick, and that's a huge one. And so those that don't have the basketball analogy down, you see them pivoting constantly, and you can't lift your foot up, otherwise you get fouled, those types of things. So you got to be able to kind of do that quickly and on the spot. So yeah, I love that description of like everything doesn't go as smooth as butter throughout your day, for sure. Yeah.
So true.
Well, I have one last question, and Mateus probably has some questions for you too. What would you say was the most challenging aspect of as a dietitian that you remember experiencing in residential level of care? What anything stand out for you that was kind of I didn't see that coming, or or maybe there's too many to think about?
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. So when I think about this one, I'm thinking a little bit about both as a dietitian and then also like as a leader in that organization. And so I think things that were interesting or challenging as a dietitian sometimes was the intensity of the dynamics that you have with clients that you're working with of any age. The role of the dietitian brings up a lot of feelings for people. I mean, you see that at every level of care, but you can be the most loved or the most despised in any given moment by the same person even. And that's part of their work. And one, how to not take that personally and how to not kind of overcompensate by trying to be liked as a human versus doing the work that someone needs, and how much to challenge them and how to really hold a relationship with someone and also push them and challenge them to do more. Even when they've done something really amazing and great, how do you say that's amazing and great, and I'm going to ask you to try to do something that's hard again? Those things I think were surprising for me. So just the intensity of the actual relationships with people that I really loved, and I really I really think that the relationship is what heals people in every situation. So you don't have to be their friend, but it's a unique kind of relationship that you have with them. Um, I would also say, just as an interesting thing, the other thing that surprised me in residential level of care is the amount of times we, as all staff, were participating and helping people learn basic life skills that really didn't have much to do with their recovery, arguably. But how to wash your clothes, or how to fill the dishwasher so it doesn't look like my son filled it. It's like, how do you fill the dishwasher so the dishes actually get clean? Like, how do you start a dishwasher? Just little things like that were really interesting to see. Like, it was humbling in the sense of like, these people are really living here. This is their home, and they're trying to learn how to be away from their family of origin, or their family home environment where someone might have done these things for them. There's a lot of overwhelm and some really kind of what we might think of as simple things. So those are some things that I think about in that regard. I would say, as a leader, things that were challenging and continue to be in this space are the how to support another professional in being dedicated to their work, and also keeping them from like a pretty straight trajectory to burnout. I think it's possible at every level of care. I would say residential level of care, in my experience, seems to have the highest risk of really rapid burnout, because it's a living environment. Like, you can almost live there.
Yeah.
People are there 24/7. If you're working late, nobody's going to say, oh, you should really go home.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, but there are people there that are working 24 hours a day. So it's not weird that you're there working, even if you've been there since, 8 o'clock in the morning and you came in early to get ahead of things. There's always something that someone needs at residential level of care. And so figuring out how to balance that, like, I really want to help people and I'm here to make a difference, with the fact that you'll never always meet everyone's needs 100% of the time, and trusting that other people can do it. I think I see dietitians really struggle with that too. It's like, yes, you're the dietitian, but there are other people who can handle dinner. There are other people who can figure out evening snack, whether there's yogurt in the fridge or not. Like, you don't have to, do it all yourself. So I think that is something, as a leader, that was really important to support dietitians around. It's like, you can learn how to do the work, but if you can't learn how to separate yourself from the work and leave at the end of the day and come back refreshed the next day, then you might do great work, but it might not be very long before you kind of have burnt the candle at both ends. And then the other thing that I think I already spoke about too, that really comes up, that I think is challenging, is that same perspective of like, I know I have this in-depth dynamic with these clients, and so I know the most about them, versus that collaboration with the outpatient team and how valuable that is. And even if the outpatient team has not worked with them for that long, if you want this individual to be successful in their recovery when they leave, you need to be collaborating on that behalf. So it's not just about what you're doing in this moment, it's about the rest of this person's life and how can you set them up for success. So I would say those are probably some of the things that related to the actual work that I see as challenging, and in my experience, and certainly going up through the ranks as a leader, I would say it's that balancing personal advocacy and figuring out how to make decisions that are right for the organization and right for the clients, and both at the same time. So those are big learning experiences for me as well.
Oh gosh, I think this is where kind of mentorship or supervision or consultation can really help, especially at the beginning. So that's one thing I would just really press, is that wherever you're starting, even if you have some support, wherever you are seeking and getting your own support outside of that, and investing in that for yourself can be really helpful, especially for someone who's been there, like your level of care, or if you're wanting to be outpatient, working with, provider that really has been an outpatient for a while, those types of things. And I know that's when I sought some of your support, was the aspect of supervision, and kind of even though my practice wasn't residential, like it still was very applicable to be able to kind of apply it in my
Absolutely.
group practice. So because I see it, the burnout, even in, residential, you see them turn over. They're there for a year, and then all of a sudden you see them in their outpatient practice starting that, which it can be fine. It's okay. But then you're trying to, again, do two at the same time too. Sometimes they're still working there and doing outpatient. I'm like, how in the world are you handling this? That is two different worlds you're trying to learn. And so I can imagine they get so tired and exhausted. So no, that was well
Yes.
said. And so thank you so much. Well,
Yes.
Mateus, what would you say you have for Miss
I have a
Amanda?
few like curiosity questions, you know. So, for newer dietitians in the field, I was wondering if when you're working in the residential levels of care, if there is any food service, parts of the job that you have to pick up sometimes. Because I was wondering, they have food there that has to be stored properly, has to be purchased, like menu planning and all those things. How does that process kind of work?
That is such a great question, Mateus. And I would say that is probably the primary unexpected element of working in residential treatment. I'm so glad that you asked that question, because because everyone is so aware of the intensity of the clinical work that you do as a dietitian in residential level of care, that the food service work kind of seems like, kind of like it just comes along with it. But I would say, in my experience, I found that many dietitians really struggle with the food service element. There are, in different residential programs have different structures. Some have chefs or cooks, some the dietitian is cooking, some another staff member is cooking. So the dietitian may have a certain level of responsibility, culinary responsibility themselves, or they may be tag teaming with another culinary expert. And I think that there are challenges in all those things. I have to say, and many people know this about me as a dietitian, but I can cook. I am not super creative in the kitchen. It is just not in my wheelhouse. Like I can cook, I can, it's safe, all those things. It can taste fine. It's not anything special. And so I can understand, I really resonate with dietitians that feel overwhelmed by the food component. And then we have dietitians who are very skilled in the kitchen and are amazingly talented and creative. And I think it's a balance of, what works for different people. But there are times where there's also food service oversight. The things that you mentioned, Mateus, like checking temperatures, and we have food inspections from the health department and from JACO and all of these other places where there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of important oversight in an actual functioning kitchen. Food service delivery and the frustrations and the ins and outs of that. Budgeting, budgeting around food costs, with all of the moving pieces and all of the food accommodations and different meal plans and all of those pieces. There's a lot of interesting food service management experience that can come out of that, for some dietitians, but not everybody wants that experience. I have to say, I've done far more food service management in my career than I ever anticipated that I would, and I found it interesting and kind of and I found some motivation in it as I understood more as a leader. But I would say the average dietitian that wants to work with eating disorders is not like, oh, and I'd love like a side of food service management with that job as well. So that's a really great question, and I think it's really valid. And different programs have different structures, but it's not a question that a lot of dietitians ask when they're looking at potential opportunities.
This is where I always
Yeah.
think, just getting a couple of years in clinical before you even get into, if you wanted to do eating disorders, you like get in clinical, because sometimes like clinical programs, like they have Sodexo or they have major corporations and they have it all down. And so you're going to have to learn that in clinical too, because you're going to be in that department. And so that you're learning some of the food service, so that could really translate. If you wanted to go into residential, then you have a little bit of food service backing to it. But that really helped me knowing it, because I was in clinical for a good 3 to 5 years before I started, even other aspects of my career. And now I can always look, like every bit of that informed me. I was so grateful to have all the other experiences I had before I even went into the eating disorder field. But may not be what you want to do exactly, but I think it can be well-rounded. So anyway, just going to throw that out there before you even do residential. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for so much for that answer. It was something that kind of crossed my mind, and it was like I don't know, because some hospitals, like, they're so large that there is a separation, between the food service piece. There's like a different director for that area, you know. And then I was reflecting about, the challenges during the pandemic with the chain supply and everything, supply chain. And imagining like having to hold space for, the actual therapeutic work and the background chaos that
Yes.
was happening during the pandemic and everything. Um,
great question.
the other question that I had, that it's a little bit of more on the curiosity side, is the patient, the client advocacy piece, because I've been working in the outpatient, level of care. And something that I notice, through collaboration, is that sometimes there's a mismatch between what the client really needs, and what sometimes insurance is kind of pushing, like for the length of stay and everything. Um, how was your experience with that, working at that level of care, having to be like, hey, this person's actually not ready to discharge or to step down. Like, what can we do here?
Yes, yes. So I want to speak to the insurance piece, but I'm going to start by maybe dating myself a little bit by on another element of that by saying when I started in this field, it was not even typical that dietitians would be in the treatment team or staff meetings at residential facilities. Dietitians were kind of extraneous, and they would have, meetings to talk about all of the clients in the program, and the dietitian may not even be included or may pop in and out with a really quick update. And I think that kind of interacts with your question in the sense that there are so many times that having the whole treatment team together is so important to understand the whole picture of what a client needs. Because we all know a client may be doing really well therapeutically, but they're really struggling with food. And that's kind of, that's the way that, that's the way that the eating disorder serves people in certain ways. Or the dietitian may feel like, oh, they're doing so great with the food piece. And the therapist may say, oh, they're really struggling around some family dynamics or whatnot. And so having the whole team together creates that whole person picture that's so important for that level of care. And that's something as outpatient providers that you all know that you really have to collaborate to get that whole picture. And to be open to a client that's having a different experience in a different area of their recovery work. So I think that that's an element that another piece of advocacy that not just myself, but so many dietitians in our field really advocated. Dietitians need to be able to be in the room for those conversations. And, my hope is that has fully continued everywhere. I feel like we really kind of claimed our spot in that way. And I think there's a lot of value amongst the team for dietitians in response to that. From an insurance standpoint, I think it's interesting because in residential level of care, the insurance is has their systems. They often want one update. They don't want it to take a lot of time. They want they're looking for specific things. What's interesting is often those things have a lot to do with what the nutrition department is working on, what the dietitian is working on. They get distracted by things that we have, our own concepts around that we know and understand in a different way. Like, what is their BMI, or how much weight have they gained or lost, or whatever the questions are from insurance. They look at it very kind of overly all or nothing. And there are so many times that myself or another dietitian has been part of those insurance calls. And again, it's kind of that, like, I'm just going to squeeze right in here because I know the insurance company doesn't really want the dietitian on the call, but I'm just going to squeeze in and I'm just going to talk. And I'm going to talk to them about what we're seeing. And there's so many times that makes such a huge difference. And I won't get into the whole insurance, debacle, but there's so many times that someone coming in and speaking with confidence and understanding the work that they're doing and really knowing their client can really say, I hear that you're asking this question, but this is how we see it. And this is what we see with this client when we're working with them, when we're sitting at the table with them, et cetera. And this is what I feel like they need in order to be successful. And so I think that there are so many ways that dietitians have made a difference in those conversations, and teams in general, teams that understand nutrition care, whether the dietitian is in the room or not, can make all the difference. And there's so many times that I had therapists and other providers say, can I just ask you about this? Like, can I just better understand this? So when I talk to the insurance, I can speak to it. And that, I think, is huge as well. And especially in the residential level of care, that all of the team members can speak really clearly to the nutrition care that's being provided and the recommendations that are being made.
I like the insurance company is the proverbial needle that pops the bubble they're in. And you might see stability, all those outcomes, but we're like, it's not always the outcomes we're looking for. I mean, we want to see that, but it's also the things that get you there, the conversations at the table, or the behaviors they're still engaging in, even if they're stable, or they've gained some weight or lost some weight or whatever the insurance company is looking for. It's really frustrating that they're so outcomes oriented. And the minute they hear what they want to hear, out comes the needle. They're like, yes, but they're not ready to be out of this bubble right now. So, so that's really well said.
Yeah. And I think that, that goes back to one of the earlier questions about challenges. And I would say this is a great example of what you were describing earlier too, where you're like, as the dietitian, therapist, whoever's on the treatment team, like, you have to learn how to pivot in response to what the insurance company has determined. Many individuals cannot pay beyond what their insurance covers. And, again, I won't get into the debacle of how that shouldn't be expected of people in the United States anyways, but it's the idea being like, if insurance says they have 3 more days, or we're cutting today, or whatever it is, like, you have to pivot and you have to prepare that individual with as much confidence as possible and instill as much confidence as possible in them so that they're ready to step down to the whatever insurance has dictated, whether it's PHP, IOP, outpatient, that you are instilling in that person, you can do this. These are the things that you have learned and done, and this is what you're going to do with it at the next level. And then collaborate with whoever they're going to land with in order to make that successful. But that's another huge challenge. And I would say an emotional experience for most of us as providers is, how do you prepare someone that would really get the most benefit from more time? And how do you do it in a way where you give them the most hope possible?
Gosh, I remember they used to give 90 days minimum, and now it's 3 to 4 weeks or something like that in residential sometimes. So it's scary.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when we had folks in residential level of care for 10, 11 months, sometimes longer. All different experiences for different people and different, feasibility. But yes, it is much more common now that it's, 3 to 4 weeks that someone is allowed that level of care.
Gosh, thank you so much, Mateus. Great questions that I wasn't even thinking of. So I think that's great to kind of like have that well-rounded piece, and I really appreciate all your time and just well-spoken. And there's so many great sound bites to put in our reels and all of that with today's conversation. So I really, really appreciate it that you gave us a good hour of your time to come chat with us.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm so honored to be included, and I appreciate the work that both of you do so much. So thank you for including me.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, we'll see you next time.